It's only the benefit, it's just the thing.
Why is there like no air in here?
I don't know, I think it's you.
These specifications you were looking for?
Yeah.
And those guys are available by phone. There's an index. I think there's good documents in there too. And there's some. And there are a bunch more. These are extra more detailed drawings. So those are all the elevations and maps showing everything that's going on, where it's going. Where is? You could probably ask when we call them. Oh, there you go. That's what I can explain it orally, but
You ready?
yeah. No, we're recording already. We're live.
All right, let's call to order the meeting of the New York State Cemetery Board, July 25th, 2018. I'm Mark Passon, the designee for the Secretary of State, Rosanna Rosado.
Paul Ambrose, representing Commissioner Howard Zucker of the Department of Health.
Jill Faber, representing Attorney General Barbara Underwood.
Alicia Young, Associate Accountant, Division of Cemeteries.
Tony Malone, Counsel to the Cemetery Board.
Louis Polishuk, Director of Division of Cemeteries.
Okay.
Josh, work for us.
Administration report.
I don't know what I know. I don't assume had it.
What is it?
The legislative report.
Oh, we do it?
Do you have it on your? You don't have it on your device?
It's on.
Do you usually have it?
All right, so
No, that's not.
I don't think I have any particular opening remarks. It's, we've got probably some good things on the agenda for us to discuss. Nobody's new, everybody's experienced on the board, and so let's welcome. Can I have us look at the minutes of the previous meeting?
I'm against it.
The only comment or question that I have is to Mr. Polishuk's report that there was no movement pending on, pending legislation, or was that Mr. Malone?
No, Tony was not here.
Time was there for that.
Thank you.
Either for the whole meeting or for that piece. I can't remember.
Thank you. And I have minor edits.
Okay.
Okay, so motion to, I'll make a motion to approve the minutes. Jill second, all in favor?
Aye.
Minutes are approved.
Good.
Tony, do you want to talk to us? Oh, he's looked up.
You went to get his, so why don't I do the division report first?
All right, let's swap around.
So I don't have that much to report, except that we are having a very large, we're having a division-wide meeting in Syracuse tomorrow. We have a very long agenda. Part of it is to make sure that we've done a couple of important things internal procedure-wise, which y'all know about already, which is our, procedure-wise, which is our online reporting system. We've done we have a new database for things, and we'll make sure that everybody knows how to use all that stuff. We also have lots of things going on. I'll just give you some examples, because we'll probably have a report out next month. Some examples are, we're going to go over our new procedure for getting things to you guys, to make sure that they get to them in timely fashion, well edited, and with adequate time for council to review them, and subsequently for y'all to read them, which seems to me to be a very sensible thing to do. And thanks to the chair and to Mr. Beams there for cracking the whip to make sure we actually do that. We're also talking about a couple of recurring policy situations, like, for example, reorganizational meetings, situations where cemeteries are expressing a possible desire to convey to a town, and things we can do to try to help them. Our job one by statute is to ensure that cemeteries are run on a not-for-profit basis and do not become a burden on the community. So in the not becoming a burden on the community, our goal is to come up with a better drill for initial conversation about things we can do to say, hey, listen, before you go ahead and do that, let's talk about X, Y, and Z, and I'm sure I will have much more to report after we have this meeting. Okay. That's really all we've got right now. We do have some personnel things going on in the division. We are going to be losing 2 out of 3 folks in our Buffalo office through retirement, working on replacements as we speak. But in case, I know we will have Sam, this is probably our last opportunity to thank Sam in absentia for his 41 years of service to the division. And we will have more than ample opportunity to thank Cindy Craig before she retires in September. So I'll defer on that.
Okay.
What?
Secretary.
Oh, yes! Thank you, Alicia. Come August 9th, we will have a new secretary for the division. Not a new secretary of state, a new secretary for our division, which, contrary to the title, is more of an office administrator function than a secretary function. And we're pleased, can I say the name? Yeah, he's officially it. So we're pleased to welcome back to the Department of State Mr. David Jacobson, who I know some of you with a long history in the cemetery business know it's not that David Jacobson. It's a different David Jacobson. But as a former employee of the department, he took promotion to another agency, and we, and I think the department, are very happy to be getting him back. So y'all will meet him next time.
Especially Alicia. And Chet.
And Chad.
Okay. Anybody have any questions of Louis for his division report? No. Okay. Back to Tony Melillo with the legislation and regulations.
Yep. So, 2 bills passed both the Assembly and the Senate. There was action on other bills, but since the legislature has ended their session, nothing's going to happen with those bills. The 2 that passed both houses, it's number 11 in the report, Assembly 5784-B. This prohibits the construction of any mausoleum or columbarium in the cemetery where the mausoleum or columbarium is the only form of interment, where they don't have burial grounds. There's some exceptions, but that's generally what the bill does. So that's making its way to the governor's desk. And the other one is the last one in the report, number 21, Senate Bill 7835-A. This was quite a lengthy bill, but the summary really doesn't do it justice. It would require cemeteries and the cemetery board to give municipalities advance notice when a cemetery is heading towards abandonment. The cemetery board would have 60 days to report the cemetery's finances to the municipality, and at that point, it requires certain steps to prevent abandonment, avoid abandonment. It also allows the municipality to require the appointment of a receiver if the property is not in a condition that the town can just simply is ready to accept. And it allows the municipality not only to make an initial application, as we always do, for abandonment funds, it allows it to come back 25 years later for additional abandonment funds for buildings and structures. That's an entirely new concept. So that also is making its way to the governor's desk. Okay, and that's it.
So question, in terms of allowing a receiver to be appointed, it's just the municipality that has the authority to do that, or is it the division of the
It
board?
requires the cemetery board, I don't have the exact language in front of me, but it requires the cemetery board to appoint a receiver at the request of the municipality. So the municipality requests it, and the board is required to comply with that request. Now, obviously, the board itself can't appoint a receiver, it doesn't have that power, so I have to go to the Attorney General and ask the OAG to make application.
I don't see how anything in there would affect our ability to ask you to represent us to go to court to get a receiver when it's abandoned or not abandoned.
So it's not, in other words, there's nothing that gives an exclusive, the municipality the exclusive authority to determine what happened. It doesn't usurp any of that.
It requires, the language is, I'm pretty sure, that it requires the cemetery board to appoint.
Okay.
Now, whether that's interpreted as requiring the cemetery board to make application of the proper facts, that certainly
Right.
sounds like a reasonable interpretation.
Okay,
Right.
that was my interpretation, but I didn't.
Right. language could have been a bit more clear on that it still has to meet the standards of the receiver, for the equipment receiver.
Okay, any other questions? I mean, we certainly do see an increase in abandonments over time, so it's an issue for us to grapple with.
And actually, one of the issues is, like I said, it's a new concept that cemeteries will be able to come back 25 years later and seek abandonment funds. One of the questions in interpreting this is whether that would take effect immediately, so that a cemetery that made an application 25 years ago, immediately when the bill takes effect, it would come to us and seek funds. It's a question of interpretation. That's a possible interpretation.
Okay, great. All right, let's move into the agenda. Beverly Hills is here,
Yes.
and you'd like us to get your board
Yes,
chair.
please.
Sure. Which one? It's just, you just pick up and dial one in the area code.
This?
Yeah, I have.
John Welshans?
Hi, John. This is Rich Fryman. We're at the meeting now, so you're on speakerphone.
And I
Oh,
should,
great, okay.
and I should
Can you hear
warn
me?
Yeah, I should warn you that you are being recorded for posterity and being broadcast live to a handful of viewers via live stream.
Wow.
So this is kind of your TV and radio debut.
Okay.
So, Liz, do you want to start, or do you want to
Sure.
Start, or how do you want to?
I'll start. So, Beverly Hills is a large, it's the largest cemetery under our jurisdiction in Putnam County. They are running out of space for burials. They're down to, I think, approximately 5 acres. The number has varied a bit. They are a cemetery in which there are certificates of indebtedness outstanding. To my knowledge, not a cent of principal has ever been paid down. Although the idea of a certificate of indebtedness is that somebody, once upon a time, gave seed money to establish the cemetery. In return, they got back a certificate that would entitle them to payments. Certificates of indebtedness are typically scheduled as a flat annual, have a fixed interest rate, and they're supposed to pay back that debt as they start making money, et cetera, et cetera. Now, these certificates have changed hands several times, mostly with the board's consent, but have not, nobody, as far as I know, has ever paid any principal on these certificates. There's $2.1 million outstanding. These certificates give the holders of the certificates rights to vote a certain amount of interest at annual meetings, which effectively means that they get to choose the board. This is not entirely uncommon downstate. There are a few cemeteries in western New York that have these too, although I think those have mostly been canceled or otherwise abandoned. The certificates are held by an entity that is controlled by 7 members of a particular family, the shippers, one of whom's here. Two of the shippers who own an interest in the entity that holds the certificate own land that are adjacent to the cemetery, and a group that is similar and perhaps, I think, identical to the group that owns the entity that owns the certificates, owns some other land that is adjacent to the cemetery. Those folks, the Irwin and Leon Shipper for one group, and Glenwood LLC, Glenwood Park LLC, wants to, for being the other group, would like to sell the land, and the cemetery would like to buy from them a bunch of adjoining land, 55 acres, to use for burials. Now the division is kind of in a unusual posture here. As a matter of principle, we think it would be a good idea for this cemetery to acquire more land. If they were to shut their doors tomorrow, their permanent maintenance fund is not adequate to cover the cost of maintaining the cemetery. So the only way they're going to be self-sustaining is if they can acquire more land and sell it profitably and build up that fund. It's, I think, always best for a cemetery to acquire adjoining land, because then it can simply expand its operations. This land looks very much like, not all of it, well, yeah, this land looks very much like the land on which the cemetery is situated right now, so developing it would be something that the cemetery's operators are familiar with and are ready to do. By the way, a little bit of history. This transaction came before the board back in, I believe, March of 2017, or was prepared to come before the board. And the application ultimately was tabled because certain adjustments were made because of concerns we had. The main concerns we had as a division were that the price was too high, was not supported by any by the appraisals that were provided with viewed appropriately, and all of the risk of the transaction was placed on the cemetery. Those concerns have been somewhat alleviated by restructuring the transaction to be somewhat in the nature of, by reducing the price and restructuring the transaction to be somewhat in the nature of what's called land share certificates. Another way cemeteries were financed in the old days was, instead of giving a certificate of indebtedness, which is basically just a note, they would give, the promoter would give money. In return, they would get a share of the proceeds of the sales. The way the transaction is structured right now, the repayment would be made based on sales in the new sections. So if they don't sell nothing, the sellers of the land don't get nothing. And as they sell the land, the money goes to them, and the debt to the sellers is paid off. That's overstating, because some of the money is going to be back, and some of the money is going to be via that. But we still have some concerns about the transaction. They're laid out in my recommendation, which I have shared with counsel for the cemetery, given an opportunity to respond. In no particular order, our concerns are that the way the deal is structured right now, the entire risk of the costs of rezoning fall entirely on the cemetery. We have had some conversations with the town. It is not entirely clear that the town is going to be supportive of this transaction. In fact, I think it is quite likely that they will oppose it, in which case lengthy litigation will result, all of which the cemetery will have to pay for out of pocket. We got a problem with that, to use a technical legal term. The cemetery is primarily making money now via bulk sales to various groups, mostly Chinese, some, I believe, the Muslim community. Cemeteries are required to file a price list with us. The cemetery is not in compliance with that because these bulk sales are at a price lower than their quote-unquote rack rate, if you will. And they don't have a bulk, they have not had a bulk sales charge filed with us. Now, price lists are different from service charges. We don't review them, but they still have to be filed with us. So we have an issue there of compliance. We also have some concerns about the extent to which the independent directors actually considered alternative transactions. Really, the only indication that the indications from what minutes provided to us are they asked the sellers to sell them less land, and the seller said no, and they looked at whether there was any other adjoining land for sale, and did not find any other adjoining land for sale. Well, that is partially compliance with the requirement that they consider transactions that are not with related parties, but I don't know that that necessarily exhausts the limit of options the cemetery could consider in terms of operations. I would like to see a little more real consideration given of what their options are, and that they actually made an effort to go and find some other transaction, and then compared it to doing business with insiders and concluded that doing business with insiders was the right way to go. We are concerned that the appraisals provided don't really value the property in any way that the board can follow or understand. Two of the appraisals make a bunch of assumptions about current cemetery operations, then essentially extend those to the land and say, we're going to use an income approach to appraising them, and based on the income approach, if the cemetery makes X number of dollars in its current form, well, if they now have these acres, will make Y number of dollars, so the cemetery is worth Y. That seems to me to be circular. Again, I'm not purporting to, the third appraisal does look at comparable sales, but values the property, it treats the best and highest use as if an adult residential community was built in there with a certain number of units. It's not at all clear where those assumptions come from or how different assumptions might actually make it. Whether this I did not get from the appraiser how this particular number of units in this particular use group is in fact the best and highest use. I understand generally that there is such a concept as best and highest use, but generally when the cemetery board reviews transactions, they look at appraisals that are based on what the raw land is worth. Because you can use land for lots of different things. Different buyers may have different abilities to develop land differently. A not-for-profit can do things with land that a for-profit can't, for example. And I would have liked to have seen what raw land was selling for. I tried to kind of back into that. I did some calculations, but I'm not sure that the price is no good, but I really like to see that from an appraiser and not me doing it in the back of an envelope based on data that I have gleaned from a single appraisal that doesn't actually use that method. Because that appraiser, the one that actually did a sales comparison approach, valued the property on a per unit basis, not a per acre basis. And you can always build more units, you can always build fewer units. I don't know what local zoning is, I don't know if they're going to the fullest level. And finally, one other thing, which is sort of a broader consideration, is certificates were never, ever, ever intended to last in perpetuity. They were meant to be paid down. I've had a lot of back and forth with council to the cemetery, and I think we've actually made some good progress on this issue. The shippers at another cemetery where they held certificates entered into an agreement that if they weren't able to pay the interest on the certificates in 1 year, any balance unpaid would vanish. Instead of just accruing interest forever that the cemetery can never pay off, settling it with debt, perpetuating the owner's control. They are willing to make such an agreement here, and I'm making an assumption that they would be willing to make the documents reflect that. We've also had conversations about paying down principal. There we haven't gotten quite as far. My understanding, and again, we've had a little back and forth, I'll let them speak for themselves, is that they're not averse to the idea of paying down the accrued interest and paying off principal, but aren't willing to commit to a schedule or method for doing that. I would like to see a schedule or method of doing that so that at some definable moment, this cemetery will actually will be for the first time actually, be controlled by its lot owners. So I guess broadly speaking, we are not prepared to recommend approval of this transaction as it is structured right now, but we're not averse to the idea of this land or some portions of this land being acquired, provided that we had a greater degree of confidence in the valuation, in the fact that the related party transaction is in fact the most beneficial transaction to the cemetery, and that the cemetery isn't bearing unlimited risk in terms of what it would have to spend to make this land usable for cemetery use. Only about half of it is according to the cemetery usable as of right for cemetery use. The rest would require rezoning. or variance. And there's a lot of risk there. And there could be, from what our experience with the Oakwood Cemeteries litigation with the town of Mount Kisco, this could run up a very large legal bill, all of which the cemetery would have to pay.
And they could lose.
And they could lose, just like Oakwood did. Because this is in the same court, the same geographic area of the court that decided the Oakwood case, and I'm paraphrasing here, and I'm not speaking as counsel to anybody, but the Oakwood case said, more or less, that towns have very broad authority to do zoning in cemeteries. Not a very precise formulation, but they were pretty broad in what they said that the town would do. I think the village in that case would do. So there was a lot of risk that the town simply said, no, 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 no. They were not succeeding in getting that land. In which case, they're free to cancel the transaction, but if they fight it, as opposed to canceling it the second they hear no, they could have incurred a ton of costs. So that's where we're at.
There's only two factual matters I want to add to what Lewis has presented. I don't think, he mentioned that there's accrued interest. I don't think he mentioned that it was another $2 million. So total debt, as of now, is over $4 million.
The accrued interest actually slightly exceeds the principal. My recollection is 2.3 million versus 2.1 million.
So I don't know if in the discussion about not allowing further interest to accrue, there was a discussion about doing away with the already accrued interest. I am in those conversations. I think the other, this is a minor point. Lewis said the 2017 application tabled. I believe it was actually withdrawn.
Yes, you're correct. You're correct.
So this is a new application. It's not the same application.
This was
It's a new clock.
For record speaking, this was newly submitted on November 21st, 2017, and was followed by numerous requests for additional information, both by us and by council.
And then the other thing I want to point out, so I've provided the board council's memo, which is confidential. It goes into more detail on some of the issues Lewis has discussed, as well as I think there's other issues that are part of the division's presentation. And if the board wants to discuss that should probably occur in executive session because it's legal advice.
So, just to ask the board, do you want to hear from the cemetery first, or do you want to ask questions? How do you want to?
If I could just ask a question, because I think, I'm not sure if our callers could run into this. So you mentioned that there were some, that the appraisals were considering other uses for the property, like in the whole community.
One appraisal in particular.
Okay. Obviously, to me, it seems as though the zoning concerns are going to be a concern regardless of what the use is, if the use is not consistent with what the current zoning is. So my question is, are the appraisals that consider other uses, are those uses consistent with, if you know, if not, maybe our caller can.
I can address that with respect to the one that did a sales comparison approach, because I remember looking at this, and I wrote in my memo on page 7, HPA, Hudson Property Appraisers, also assumes no cost or risks associated with changing zoning to allow for use of the property, and makes no deductions for cost of development other than a putative sewage treatment facility and road access that would not actually have to be built for cemetery use, but would be required for building a hypothetical adult community on this property. I don't remember what the other two say about zoning, but the other two really are based on a broader level, are based on the concept that this property is just like the cemetery's property, will be exactly as profitable as the cemetery's been, and in fact even more profitable because they make assumptions that are not consistent with how the cemetery operates, although they've, in their updates to their appraisals, they've actually addressed that and made certain deductions, so I think they're I don't know whether I buy their whole model to begin with, but within their model, assuming the truth of their model, they're not as far off as they were before, because their projections make certain deductions for unusable land and make certain other assumptions that make them somewhat less absurdly rosy.
Even the cemetery folks?
I want to thank you.
Again, introduce yourself.
Richard Fryman. My firm is Richard Fryman Associates. I represent Beverly Hills Cemetery. I want to thank you all for allowing us to be on this agenda today. It's been a long time coming, and a number of years now. And this is going through various forms, and we think that at this point in time, there's a very positive application for the board for the benefit of the cemetery, which desperately needs this land in order to remain profitable and sustain itself in the future. As an overview, we're talking about 55.5 acres, of which 48.5 of those acres can be used without concern. There's an issue of 7 acres that is considered a wetlands by the town. It's not DEC wetlands, and engineering reports have said that they can turn that land around when they put in proper drainage. So we either 55.5 acres or 48.5 acres, basically. The purchase price is $2.8 million. The down payment is coming directly from the general fund of $800,000. The general fund now has $1.7 million in it, and the $800,000 taken out of that will not impact the ability of the cemetery to function. We still have plenty of money to run the cemetery. The payments, as Louis said, will be made on a basis to the sellers as the land is sold. So we agreed to do it quarterly, and as land is sold, the sellers would get their money. There is no permanent maintenance fund loan involved in this proposal. It's all coming out of the general fund. So there's no additional debt to the permanent maintenance fund going forward. There's no interest being charged on this loan, which you could never get from a bank or any other lender. There is no acceleration of payments, so that if there is a default, they don't get the money, and the obligation to the sellers are subordinated to the needs of the cemetery. So if the cemetery needs the money, even though the land is sold, the sellers don't get the money. Contributions to the permanent maintenance fund based on sales. Statutorily, they're required to be 10%. In this proposal, we agreed to put 15% of the sales into the permanent maintenance fund, which will significantly increase the growth of that fund. Without the sellers, we required the sellers will not sell less than the 55.5 acres, so it's all or nothing in this situation. The sellers are donating land to the town of Putnam Valley to try to entice the zoning issues. A substantial amount of land is involved in that, nothing to do with the land that's being sold in the cemetery. And again, if the town doesn't approve the zoning, this whole deal is off. And the cemetery is not, it's back at $800,000. It's not happening. We're really not paying the zoning first. The appraisal issue will be discussed by John Burns is here from the Hudson Valley Appraisers. He can talk to you about that appraisal that was there. The other two appraisals were appraisal land with respect to using it as a cemetery. There's no point in appraising land with no purpose involved, because dependent on the purpose dictates the price of the land. So in this situation, at the end of 2017, the market value of the permanent maintenance fund is $6.2 million. With our increasing contributions from 10 to 15% on new land sales, that fund will grow to over $24 million in 50 years. When that land sells out, the cemetery will be able to sustain itself. If we don't get the land, the cemetery will not be able to sustain itself. It's as simple as that. It will become terminally the town. The average sale price of graves in 2017 was $2,940. 2/3 of that were private sales, and 1/3 of that were bulk sales. With respect to division's report, I will say that and I'm not gonna dwell on it. The report is filled with some misrepresentations and inaccuracies. It's not, we're not gonna go into that today, it's no purpose in doing that today. But there were 5 issues that were identified by division, that we just got that report actually last week. So we haven't had a lot of time to go over that. But with respect to the cost of the rezoning of the property, and with respect to the issue of the certificates, the interest payments, and whether or not there's going to be any pay down of certificates, which we don't believe can be mandated, the sellers have agreed to submit a plan very quickly, within the next 15 days or less, as to how they're going to deal with those issues. In other words, putting in writing something with respect to the paying down of the interest, whether or not there's going to be a pay down of the principal, and with respect to the cost issues and how that's going to be allocated. Right now, the cemetery pays it, and whether or not we can negotiate something with the sellers. So we asked that that be done. I've been assured that that could be done within the next 15 days, getting something together with the parties involved, and we would submit that for a further meeting, further review, and then a further meeting at a time. With respect to the bulk price list, I believe the lists have been posted in the cemetery, but if there's something missing, we certainly will post whatever is necessary. But I know there was a price list effective October 1st, 2016. We don't have the prior price list before that. We've looked for them, we can't find them. But certainly there's a price list that's posted in the cemetery effective October 1st, 2016. And with respect to the issue of appraisals, I'm going to defer to John Burns, who's here. With respect to the issue that division brought up about the alternatives under Not-for-Profit Corporation Law 715, Mr. Walshon's chairman of the board can speak to that as well. That's why he's on the phone. And with respect to the, I will say that with respect to the appraisals and the combativeness when it comes to the income approach that's been used, I will refer council and the division and the board to a Court of Appeals case, St. Agnes Cemetery versus the state. The site is 3 New York 2nd, 37, where it discusses the use of income appraisals and the fact that that division says that normally sales comparisons approach does not mean income-based appraisals are not to be considered. We believe that it is a proper use of appraisal to have an income approach, and there is law supporting that. I just want to say that this proposal is for the benefit of the cemetery in the long run, to keep it going financially, long after we're done. And I want this to be about the cemetery. The cemetery wants this to be about the cemetery, not about skipping holders, not about anything else. It's what's good for the cemetery. The fact that Irwin and Leon Schiffer own land that's adjacent to the cemetery. They bought it with the idea that it would be necessary to be needed in the future. They looked to sell it at one point for money far in excess of what this deal is about right now. When the cemetery was sold to Lowen was interested in the extra land, and I'm told that at that time other opportunities were presented and proposals were made. One of which, in fact, was for the adult community, which is where that came from. And at that time, when Lowen went out of the business of owning that cemetery, the cemetery board welcomed the Shippers back to rebuy that cemetery, and take it over again. Nobody else wanted it. It was the board that asked them to come back in on that cemetery. And it was members of the board, I'm told, that asked the shippers not to sell that land for use for adult community, because the cemetery might need to do it.
Let me just interject a little bit of history here for the newer, all the new board members, since none of you were here. Clarification: in the early 1990s, the shippers sold their certificate at this cemetery at Washington Memorial Park, also known as Cemetery Gardens, to an out-of-state for-profit conglomerate that also owned funeral homes, the Lowen Group. This transaction actually is what gave rise to New York's anti-combination law, in part. Lowen proceeded to end up in bankruptcy in the late 90s, at which point I think from his characterization of what happened with respect to the shippers reacquiring the cemetery is largely accurate, with the one exception that the former board chair categorically denies that he ever told them to hold on to the land. His best recollection on that was that there were certain discussions of the land back then. He says, I never told them to not sell it instead of the side.
So there are differences.
But other than that point, I wanted to have clarify a little bit for you. There was this whole thing of for-profit out-of-state conglomerates trying to buy up cemeteries in New York. This was part of that, and the current owners were actually part of the undoing of that.
So how do you want to do this? Do you want to?
Your time.
Okay, my nine? Okay.
You got two people to speak? Who goes first?
Let's talk with John Welshons. Are you there still? Are you sleeping?
Yes. Yes. Hello.
Hi. Okay, why don't you talk about who you are and what your experience is, and what about the looking at land and other alternatives, things like that, please.
Sure. Well, I grew up in the cemetery business in New Jersey. My father was in the business dating back to the 1920s, and so I have a pretty strong familiarity with how the business operates. And I ran Hollywood Memorial Park in Union, New Jersey for the better part of 20 years. And I realized that the business is a very unique business in which, of course, the greatest asset that the cemetery has is land, and its greatest liability is the fact that the land sells out eventually. But you still have to take care of it. So I joined the board at Rose Hills, Beverly Hills, I believe in 2015. And this matter of purchase of the adjacent land was sort of foremost in everybody's minds. And I'll tell you that I have a personal bias in terms of the business, which is that any time a cemetery has the opportunity and the financial resources to purchase adjacent land, they should do it, because it's a rare opportunity. And I think that my knowledge of the shippers, certificates of indebtedness issues aside, they are certainly among the most respected cemetery operators in the country. And they have always been concerned, as I was always concerned, the question of how does the cemetery survive into the future and not become a liability to the community. So we did discuss at board meetings the alternatives to this purchase. The problem is that reasonable and meaningful alternatives are few and far between. We discussed the possibility of building more mausoleums, but that is a market that has diminished over the years. There was a time in the 1970s, 1980s, even into the 90s, when community mausoleums were very popular. Not so much anymore. So the board obviously knows that the dramatically. And one of the ways that cemeteries can create a future is if they have the land or have the ability to purchase land to do bulk sales to ethnic groups. So I think that Lewis very articulately spelled out pretty much everything that's been on my mind since I became a member of the board at Rose Hills, which is how do we do this? It's just on its face a really good idea to purchase this land. The details of how that gets done, I'm sure that the shippers have worked with the cemetery and with the board, and I think will continue to do so. But I don't, having looked at the situation, I couldn't see any other reasonable alternative in terms of creating a major income stream for the cemetery. And I was just doing some quick calculations last night in preparation for the meeting. And if we're talking about out of the 55.5 acres, 48 usable acres, and we've reduced the projection of 1,200 grave spaces per acre to 800 grave spaces per acre. So 800 grave spaces times 48 acres is 38,400 graves. I also wanted to come up with a very conservative price to put on the graves, and our average sale, as you know, was nearly $3,000 per grave last year. I put in $2,000 per grave, considering that much of it might be in bulk sales, and that translates to $76 million in income for the cemetery. And at 15% of revenues going into the P&M fund, that would be over $11 million added to the trust fund. So I appreciate the board's concern about considering alternatives and the legal responsibility to do so. We did that, and frankly couldn't come up with anything even approaching the potential that this land purchase gives us. And when you consider $76 million in revenue against a $2.8 million purchase price, seems pretty reasonable to us.
All right.
Anybody have any questions for the solution?
No?
Chief, just tell me when the shippers bought the property, they had a relationship with Evergreen Cemetery, correct? The board or officers, they don't know the joint property. I think they were.
This is Tony Malolo, council speaking.
Excuse me, I'm having a little trouble understanding.
Sorry, counsel to the board was speaking, commented that when when Leon and Erwin Shipper acquired the properties, it is his belief that at that time they were members of the Cemeteries Board.
Mm-hmm.
Either employees or board members or both.
Right.
And you said that they bought it with the idea of eventually selling to the cemetery, correct? Okay.
That's my understanding. That's what I was told.
Right.
I wasn't involved in the cemetery.
And the gentleman on the phone, I'm sorry, I didn't get your name.
John Welshons?
John Welshons. All right. You indicated that whenever a cemetery can buy adjoining land, it should, correct?
Yes.
So I guess my question is, why didn't the cemetery buy the land when the shippers bought it?
I don't think they have the money.
Okay. And are the shippers willing to disclose what it has cost them, and are they willing to sell the land back at cost? I know they own a lot more than the 55 acres, so it would be a proportion of their cost. So that they're not making money on this transaction because they were fiduciaries and they bought the land. There's a whole issue of business opportunity, decide you can't take a business opportunity from an entity that has a fiduciary obligation to. So would they be willing to disclose their costs and sell at cost? I guess.
Well, those are two questions.
No, neither of which I know the answer.
Okay. The answer to one might be different from the answer to the other.
Anything else from Mr. Welshman?
I have nothing else. I mean, if you have any questions for me, I really can't address the two questions that were just asked. So,
Okay, well, let's go to John Burns, who's the appraiser. Hudson Valley. Please go.
Thank you. My name is John Burns, B-E-R-N-Z. The company is Hudson Property Advisors. For the record, it's not Hudson Valley.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Sorry.
Hudson,
Oh, I got it wrong in a different way.
Hudson Property Advisors. I was contacted by Mr. Shipper to do an appraisal of the 55 acres. I think all of you have a copy of it. One of the assumptions that I was asked to make in that appraisal was to make it under the assumption that the property had been approved for the residential, adult residential community that was drawn up by a landscape architect with Tim Miller Associates. They prepared a plan that they felt would be most applicable to the property in terms of how many units can be built on it. When an appraisal is done of a property under the assumption that it has approvals, it would be totally erroneous to subtract the cost to get those approvals in the appraisal. Because that's the whole assumption, is valuing the property with approvals for X, Y, and Z. So when a property like this, under this assumption, is appraised, most common method is the sales comparison approach. We identified several comparable properties that were purchased for that similar use. Some in Putnam, if I recall, there were a couple in Westchester, and maybe Dutchess, I remembered. I know I looked at all three counties. There's very few sales to rely upon to begin with that were sold for that type of use. Those sales are adjusted, the traditional adjustment grid where items of dissimilarities are adjusted for size, location, number of units, topography, all these different things, to come up with a sale price per unit, which is then used to apply to the number of units to get the number for the quote subject property. And in this particular case, in order to develop the property, under that scenario, it would have required construction of a sewage treatment plant and a water, well water entity. So those costs had to be subtracted out to come up with the value as though it was approved. So that's the whole rationale behind why that appraisal came out where it did. Happy to answer any questions on the methodology.
Yeah, I do actually have two questions about what you just said.
Yeah.
Question number one is, suppose you didn't start with the assumption that the project had approvals. How would you value the land? This putative adult community, because it doesn't have the approvals. So let's assume that, as is the reality, that it does not have approval.
If it did not happen?
Correct.
I have never given that assignment.
Okay.
That wasn't-
No, I'm not asking you what the value is. I know I can't ask you that on the spot.
Right.
What I'm asking is, very broadly speaking, how would you go about
Well, for the
valuation?
most part, land is valued using the same approach, sales comparison approach.
But if you didn't know what its use would be yet, would you be coming? How would you come up with that?
I'd have to analyze the property.
Okay, so it's not a question you can ask in the answer in the
I'd
abstract.
have to analyze
Okay,
it.
that was question number one. Question number two, if I can remember it, was especially in your update, but also in your original property, the property skewed very heavily to properties in Westchester and Rockland County as opposed to Putnam and Dutchess, presumably because there was more property there. I live in Westchester County. I know anecdotally that Westchester County is a hell of a lot more expensive than Putnam, and Rockland, at least for commercial property, also seems to be a lot more expensive, just judging by your numbers. To what extent did, you mentioned that you would adjust for factors such as location. To what extent did that
Well,
valuation factor in?
Okay, so let me answer that. First of all, it's not as though there's 100 or 1,000 properties that sold for this use, and I chose the best ones. I've used pretty much every single one that I can find, okay? And then you have to make the adjustments accordingly.
Right, that was,
Yes.
my question was more about the adjustments.
Okay, so
I'm
let me
sure
get-
you're right about the absence of
Yeah,
comparable
so you
products.
use what there is. In terms of the adjustments, yes, you're absolutely right that there are price differentials between Westchester and Rockland and Putnam and Dutchess and so on. Absolutely, no question. But there's a big misconception that because a house costs more in Westchester, that every other type of property, it doesn't translate dollar for dollar like that. Like the average house price in Westchester, I couldn't tell you the number, it's probably $600,000 or $700,000, and the average house price in Putnam is, I don't know, 400 or 500. It's a huge difference, but that difference doesn't translate to office, retail, apartment buildings. It doesn't exactly translate. So same is true with adult residential community sales. Now there are differences that were adjusted for, and in my appraisal you'll see there are adjustments for location. I don't remember the exact percentage. I could look up and tell you what they are if you want, but there definitely is an adjustment that was applied. When I did the research, when I'm appraising a property like this in Putnam County, I'll frequently use, the nearby counties, Dutchess, Rockland, Westchester, and because Westchester is so much more densely developed, that's where the sales exist. So if I had more in Putnam County, I certainly would have used them. If I had any in Putnam Valley, I would have used them. But again, you have to use what there is.
So I have some questions. You said you were asked to make the assumption that it was approved for adult residential community.
Yeah.
Who asked that you make that
My
assumption?
client.
Who from the client? Do you remember who the individuals you spoke with? Was it Aaron or David?
It was probably one of the shippers, but I don't remember which one.
So is that who approached the your business for an appraisal?
I believe it was.
Did you question why that you were asked to make that assumption? Was there a discussion of that?
We may have had a discussion, I don't remember the specifics, it was a while ago, but I believe he said something about the property had at one time been considered for that use, and they wanted to have some sort of basis of comparison, something like that. I don't remember the exact discussion.
You heard Louis characterize the appraisal as given a price per unit. You agree that that's
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
So if the property were 25 acres instead of 55 acres, but had the same number of units, it would still show the same value in your appraisal, correct?
No.
Why not?
I'll give you a better example. What if it was 3 acres, and somebody's buying a property to develop a development like this? Something with more land is obviously going to have more per unit. It's going to be worth more because you have the excess land, you have ability to put in amenities, view, controlling the surroundings. So obviously the price per unit is going to be reflected on the kind of land you have.
But, all right.
Here, if it was 54 acres versus 55, probably no difference. But 25, or 10, or 5?
But if you only need 10 acres for all the amenities that this size development would need,
You couldn't fit it.
you couldn't fit this on 10 acres?
No.
No, what's the
because
minimum you would need for this?
Well,
what does the...
according to the engineering report, the 55 acres can support this specific development. Look at the plan. There's a copy of the plan. It's in my report. There's a copy of the plan prepared by
This is...
Steve. Yeah, that's it.
How many acres does the actual building occupy?
You mean the footprints of the building?
the footprint.
I don't know that that's relevant. You'd have to multiply the first floor times the number of units, and that would tell you the footprint. I don't think that's really relevant, though.
But getting back, so let me ask you this. One of the things we're grappling with is what the statute requires. The statute requires the following, section 1506 cemetery lands of a not-for-profit corporation, paragraph A, purchase of land. And the last sentence of that paragraph says, in determining the fair and reasonable, no cemetery corporation in purchasing real property hereafter shall pay or agree to pay more than the fair and reasonable market value thereof. And the board may not approve the sale unless it is determined that the cemetery won't be paying more than the fair and reasonable market value. Were you made aware of that language when you did this appraisal?
Never saw that before.
You
But
know,
this is the market value of this property under this scenario.
under that scenario.
Yes,
But that scenario doesn't match the scenario that the actual intended.
that's not my concern.
Right, because that's not what you were asking.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Burns, for how many years have you been in the prison?
Can't be more than 5 or 10, you're young.
I started in this business in 1983.
And how many appraisals have you done in that brief time? Approximately? Bigger than a bread box?
Couple thousand maybe?
In this situation, when you were asked who contacted you with respect to doing this appraisal, would it have mattered if, did it matter that it was one of the shippers that approached you as opposed to Mr. Welshans or another member of the board?
Absolutely not. The number would have been the same either way.
And why is that?
Because I've been in this business 35 years. It's a matter of staying independent. And I'm going to make a statement just for the record, and it might sound cold, and my client may fire me for this, but I don't care whether they get approved or not. I have no dog in this fight. I was asked to do an appraisal under certain assumptions. I did the appraisal, and I'll stand by that appraisal. I won't answer any questions concerning the appraisal. But to insinuate that there was a bias is an affront to not just myself, but the entire profession.
I didn't mean to say you had a bias. Not at all.
Thank you.
You mentioned that at the outset you figured in, or discounted the appraisal for the costs that you assumed would be involved in the zoning approvals. How did that process work, and how did you, what did you assume that would involve, and what kind of cost did you assign to that?
Okay, that's what I was explaining before. When an appraisal is done of a property under the assumption it is approved, then the costs of getting the approvals do not factor into it.
What you factored in instead, if I remember correctly, is the cost of getting the property ready for
Sewage,
this.
yeah, water and sewer.
And the separate access.
Yes, and in full disclosure, those are costs that I didn't come up with. They were derived by an engineer.
Right. And you assigned a cost of 0 to the zoning issues because you started with the assumption that it
Correct.
was in fact approved.
Correct.
And what, just for the record, what was your appraisal number at the end?
In the updated one, I guess.
Well, the one I have here is $3,465,000. Was there a newer? That was $3,465,000. That was done September 6, 2016.
As I sit here, all three appraisers gave us an update as of the beginning of this year. Not all of them had the price actually changed, and I can't recall which one is which, but we do have those records. We have the updates and the original appraisals.
So in determining the purchase price of a property, the terms of the sale would have to be taken into consideration by law, correct? No, I'm just making, I guess I'm making a statement that we have to take into account all the terms of the sale, which upon review, as I highlighted in the beginning, are very favorable to the cemetery. And there's there's no way they can get the rates at those terms from anybody else.
So, just to clarify, are you suggesting that the absence of interest and the fact that financing is based primarily on sales revenue goes to the fair market value of the property that the board should consider?
It's going to the terms of the deal for the benefit of the cemetery.
And that in fact should, I guess what I'm trying to understand is, are you saying that's a separate consideration? Or is that relevant to understanding what the statute says about fair market value?
The law states that. The law states you have to take that into account.
Where?
I think you're saying two different things. You're not saying that the law says you need to take that into account in terms of considering fair market value. You're saying in considering
Whether the
the
board should
application.
approve it. Yeah, no,
Which is
of
what-
course,
yeah.
of course. We all agree with that.
Okay. Anything else that you have to present, or any questions that folks have? So I have before us an application, again, just one to the sidebar. I'm going to hold on to being relatively new as long as I can. But one of the things I'm kind of committed to doing is to get projects moved along, and all deliberations on our part are required, but trying to move these projects along, get them to the board for review with the right information for the board to make proper determination. So we're bringing that before the board. We have a recommendation by the division they have not recommended approval of this. We have the ability to do whatever we want, approve this, we could table it, I guess, and we could reject it. So those are just those.
I'm going to modify my recommendation because council clearly has things to say. As in an attorney-client context, I think it would be wise for you guys to hear those things. And so my recommendation would be that the board table it at least until it's heard council's concerns in executive session. When we come out of executive session, my recommendation right now is still to reject it as it is structured right now, but I don't know. That's you.
Thank you. I don't know if that's really relevant because we have the right to do.
You can do what you want. I'm just making a recommendation.
Again, and our deliberations are public, right, except for Attorney County approved it. So I don't know if there's any questions you have.
I would like to hear what's up from the council. That's to offer. In terms of consideration.
Actually, Tony, what do you think? I don't think they have to act right now. They can just wait and hear from you and then act at the end of the meeting when they come out of executive session.
Sure.
So they don't have to table it.
So here's the situation. My memo to the board is confidential. The board has the power to make it public. So the board has a choice to discuss it in open session, which by doing so, the board will be making my memo public. Or the board can decide that if it wants to discuss the issues raised in my memo and maintain confidentiality, then it can do so in executive session. So it's up to the board how, whether it wants to make it public and then enter this discussion in open session or maintain confidentiality and have the discussion in executive session.
So I would make a motion that we defer our decision on this until we go into executive session at the end of the meeting. We'll come out with, again, our decision, any public decision. Everybody agree with that? Okay. Great. Thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for participating. You can, get dressed now. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll go ahead and
You can.
That's up to you.
Yeah.
A supplement to
That's them.
your issues? I mean,
That's them.
what I said at the beginning was there are issues that Lewis raised that we're willing to get back to them on. I just couldn't do it right now, so I don't know how you
So one
want
thing to think about when you come out of executive session is that they've offered to answer certain questions. Another possibility will be that after hearing from council, you may have more questions that you want answered, and we could direct that it be tabled until they've answered those questions.
Well, I think that makes sense. If we discuss it in executive session, there might be other questions that we have, or things we want from you. It probably makes sense to convey those all at the same
I'll call you.
That's fine.
Again, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
So So, can we do, what's called first, where's the agenda, Evergreens, not Vestal?
I think that's what it reads.
Oh, it is the way it reads, good, because they're waiting for us. Yep. So, let me give them a call.
Good morning, the Evergreen Cemetery, Devon speaking.
Hey, good morning, it's Louis Polishow calling for Julie.
Sure, one moment. Hi, Louis.
Hey Julie, you've got the entire cemetery board here. You are being recorded for posterity and broadcast live to a handful of viewers out there in TV land.
Wonderful.
We're going to be running long today.
No, that's fine, Carol, you're right. Just wondering if you're in executive session.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay,
Where can we find you if we need you?
you should be at my desk.
Okay. Thanks, Tom. All right, so.
Okay, so, Liz?
Yes, Evergreen. So I am going to give the very briefest summary of this in the interest of time. This area of Evergreen Cemetery is running out of space. This area of the cemetery was damaged during during Sandy. They have a grant. The cemetery has a grant from state parks to do restoration work, which is going to require terracing of the section. They figure that this would be a great opportunity to develop a portion of this section for in-ground burials and use the terracing as a place to install columbariums. We have given you a financial analysis and an investigator write-up, and overall think this is a very good thing for the cemetery. They are going to make just about double, a little less than double what they spend on it, a lot of which is going to go to their permanent maintenance fund, and that does not even take into account the profit that they will make on doing the interments and inurnments in the section. We didn't factor that in because we didn't have a precise handle on their unit cost for inurnments and interments, but we are fairly confident that the cemetery does actually make money on providing those services, so that the return will actually be slightly better than Gus spells out in his memo. So we think this is a good transaction. The one thing that I'll add is that may not be adequately reflected in our write-up is that they have to do the state parks work by the end of this calendar year, by the terms of their grant. So they want to get going on the cemetery-related work so that the contractor can do both of them at the same time and get this thing done. They also have a wait list already of people who want to buy graves there and would like to get going selling them.
Cost of this project is what?
They are going to spend $1.861 million.
And the money comes from?
General fund. No PM loans, no exotic sources of funding. And while there are some graves that are close to where they're doing the work, none of them are going to be disturbed by it. Since they put up the postings required because there's a columbarium being installed, they've received no complaints, but instead have received inquiries about, hey, how can I buy space?
Okay, so this is a project vision.
We recommend approval.
Recommend approval?
Yes.
Tony, do you have anything to add?
Well, just to be clear, it's two approvals, it's a major renovation,
Right,
and it's a columbarium.
correct.
What was presented in the board packet, I understand some information wasn't put in the board packet because it's in this binder that couldn't be reproduced.
Right, a lot of drawings are not in the board packet simply because a lot of these drawings are 11 by 17, and we never even figured out a way of conveying it electronically from the cemetery to us, so consequently I never figured out a way of conveying it electronically to you guys. So we do have a bound volume of drawings here.
So that,
typically when a board reviews a columbarium proposal, it sees what the structure's gonna look like and where it is in the cemetery and how the impact on the adjoining land of having a columbarium placed there. So I would ask that the board take the time to look that over. The other question I had other than that was, there's a statement, I think, in Division's report that this requires minimal maintenance.
Correct.
And I just want to make sure that that's explained, because today we have an application for another cemetery that neglected its mazel, obviously a different building,
Right.
but it's hundreds of thousands of
It's
dollars.
right, sure, I'm happy to explain that. These are sort of wall-type columbariums. Julie, correct me if I describe it incorrectly, but you kind of pour a wall and you put niches into it. There's no structure per se, there's just kind of a wall that would look very much like a very small retaining wall. It's going to be in front of the actual retaining wall, which is the thing that State Parks is paying for. The cemetery estimates, and we agree that really for this type of installation, the only maintenance is annual power washing, if that.
Because it's not structural.
Right.
Because it's adjacent.
Exactly, there's nothing structural about it. And I mean, look, in 30 years, the stone could deteriorate a bit, but the costs of maintaining this kind of unit are negligible. This is similar to installed columbariums in other cemeteries and prefab columbariums in other cemeteries, where really, if the work is done right the first time, and we have a high degree of confidence that that will happen here, they're really, the costs of maintaining it are pretty trivial. Now, for the major renovation, that doesn't really come into play, but the cost of maintaining the newly developed section should be similar to the cost of maintaining any other section of the cemetery, maybe even a little bit less because it's going to be newer and less crowded.
Maybe just in terms of what Tony mentioned, and certainly look through it, but you've obviously looked through it. From what you see and the drawings and the location, did you see any concerns with its impact on the other?
On the contrary, I think it will enhance the appearance of that section of the cemetery.
So, because it's in a new development, it's not next to an existing.
It is next to some existing graves. That was originally my assumption. I was wrong. It does abut another section, but that section is not going to be disturbed during construction, and the hillside is going to look better terraced with these wall-type columbariums than it will look now.
The SHPO grant terraces that and just, stabilizes it. The difference is then they put a columbarium in front of that, or make that a part of it, right? So it's still going to have to go out there and stabilize that property,
right?
Assuming they're going to spend the money.
Sure. So I don't think the visual is going to be all that different.
Julie?
Yes.
This is your opportunity to add to the conversation?
Oh, I just wanted to add one thing. I wanted to mention that we were concerned about the timing of the grant because the SHPO people wanted to get this done by the end of the year. We applied to SHPO basically to get an extension on the grant, which they have, I'm pleased to say they've awarded us an extension on this grant that we will have until the end of 2019. So instead of having to get it done by the end of 2018, we just got approval to get this extended to the end of 2019. It will not take us that long to do, but it just gives us a little bit of leeway.
Does that change your plans if we approve the project?
No.
You would go
it
ahead.
Won't change the plan.
You would go ahead and begin construction or start the process?
Yeah, we're going to plan to move ahead with our construction anyway. It'll just give us more time for, planting, doing our implementing our planting plan. We'll be able to have an extra season to be able to plant some stuff in the fall and some stuff in the spring.
Great.
Yeah, the only thing I should add is that our recommendation is, as always, contingent on their receipt of any required permits from New York City, and we laid out what they believe their permits are. I think Julie, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you've got one of them and your expediter's working on the rest?
Our expediter is working on the permitting now, and we don't anticipate having any issues with them, particularly because SHPO has approved has gone through everything with a fine-tooth comb, so we are confident that the expediter will have the permitting done as quickly as we can get the state of the city of New York to do it.
Are there any other comments on physical condition or executive conversation or any other issues that come?
Well, we reported on that our view is that the cemetery's in great shape and both financially and physically.
I have a question. On the yield analysis of revenue for one of the attachments.
You asked me to explain Gus's stuff.
I don't know, maybe it's challenging. My question is this, you're assuming that 56% of burials are going to be cremations?
Well, that's based on, that's the question best directed to Julie, because
it seems like a static analysis, suggesting that cremations are increasing in percentage over time. Does that affect the income?
Cremations are increasing as a percentage over time statewide. That doesn't necessarily mean that will apply in this section. I think the cemetery will be selling, frankly, they're going to be eating their own lunch a little bit here, because they'll be selling more graves in this brand new section and fewer graves here and there, and there's where they have them in the existing sections. But Julie, you can jump in here if you want, but I don't think, based on what I know from what you've told us and from just general familiarity with the New York City market, I don't know that we would trend out in the next 5 years a significant shift in sales in this section toward cremation spaces.
Not at all, and in fact, we have, unfortunately, there's a dearth right now of in-ground burial spaces, which is why we have been going through your reclamation process to be able to reclaim graves, because we have more of a demand for in-ground burials than I actually have space for. So this is going to be necessary for us to be able to accommodate the families that we have that want in-ground burials, and in particular the one in-ground burials that are on a hill and that are facing south, which is very amenable to our Chinese community. Those are specific specifications they're looking for.
So let me ask the question again, the 50%, do you view that as a conservative estimate? You just characterize that estimate so we know how it factors into your revenue projections. Best guess? I'm asking you that, Julie.
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time. We're having a hard time hearing you guys, so I'm getting every other word.
Yeah.
Maybe I can clarify. The way this was reported to us was their best estimate as to in-ground sales and niche sales over the next 5 years.
Okay. That answer your question? Okay.
Yeah.
So the investment is paid off in how many years?
Oh, was that
It's fairly
in
quick.
total, I think it was 9 years, but again, we are almost certainly underestimating the profitability of the project, because Gus didn't know the unit costs of interments and inurnments, so he did not take into account any of the interment and inurnment and foundation revenue they're going to get from the section.
So our revenue projections are very
way conservative. Yeah, they're going to beat this easily. I wouldn't be surprised if they paid this off in 5 years.
I think we'll probably sell everything easily in 5 years, and maybe less.
Okay.
And another question on the Exhibit 1, Evergreen Cemetery income statement. I noticed that the net lot sales, the net lot sales are increasing from 2014 through 2017, and the allocation to the PM funds, are those negative numbers? Is it actually going down?
Wait, where?
From 2014 to 2017?
No, That's not the, wait, where are you?
That's zone 2.
Where are you? Right here. I'm in a different place.
This is
Exhibit one.
Oh, you're on the second exhibit, second page of exhibit 1, sorry. Hang on a second. Allocation. So we've got the sales going up. You mean as a
I think
percentage?
those are in parentheses, because it's money withdrawn from general funds to go into people.
Right, what page 2 of exhibit 1 is showing is the transfer of funds from the sales into PM, so there'll be a corresponding number. The percentage-wise, they should match up exactly, and just looking at it, subject to rounding, they do.
So that's how you get a total revenue that reflects general funds, not general funds plus PM. It's a separate analysis. So they back that out.
This comes from their financial statements, but Gus does a little bit of checking even when he does one of these things. Actually, because it's Gus, he does more than a little bit of checking.
The eye roll didn't show up on the video.
Also on exhibit 1, page 1, the net periodic pension cost dropped from 2016 to 2017.
Did you cash out, Julie, on the pension?
I can't, yeah, we got out of our pension plan because a lot of the folks were getting out of the, are you talking about the union pension plan?
Yeah.
Yes. We basically paid that off in a lump sum, which is what most of the cemeteries who have the resources, like Ferncliff and Mount Hope, and some of the other cemeteries, we all basically paid off the amount to the union pension plan. We did a lump sum payment.
Yeah, they shut it down and cashed it out, which is why the drop in 2017.
Yeah, it was a defined benefit plan, so we all basically got out of the plan because the plan was not doing well. So all of us that were in Local 74 basically opted out. We all got out of the plan. And the cemeteries such as ours that had the resources paid it off because we didn't want to pay the 5.5% interest rate that the union was proffering.
Okay.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments, staff, board?
Just one thing, for 2017, it looks like, again, that's in Exhibit 1 on the first page. Direct materials and charges for 2017 looks like it's almost double what it was the couple of years before that. What does that reflect?
That reflects the fact that because our foundations, and it's a great question. Foundation charges basically are directly related to how many interments we're doing. So the number of interments is directly proportional to the number of interments that are done. And so since we've been increasing, we've had a steady increase in the number of sales that we're doing and the number of interments we're doing, the foundation charges have also increased because that's the concrete charge that we have to do to make the foundation.
Okay. So that charge is also related to income too?
Correct. It's an income-related expense.
Okay, so I would make a motion, Tony help with this, that we approve this major renovation, subject to the approval of all local requirements, local zoning and building permit requirements. Anything else I should think?
And then there's also the Columbary.
Both the major renovation and the Columbary application, two applications.
Columbary application.
And submission of architectural engineering plans.
And yes, Julie, we will need at least to see a set of stamped plans, a complete set of stamped plans from your RA or PE.
Absolutely.
We don't actually have to send them to me. It would probably be better if Carrie or I just came there and reviewed them because we have no ability to store rolled sets.
Not a problem. We'll set up a time for you guys.
Okay. So, my motion is to approve Vestal's,
Evergreens.
Evergreens.
Let's do Vestal at the same time.
Application for major renovation in the Olive area, subject to local approvals and subject to receipt of
Stamped architecture engineer.
drawing. So it's- somebody's taking notes or something, no taking notes.
I got that one.
Okay.
The standard language.
Is that an acceptable motion?
Is there a
Do
second?
I have a second?
All in favor?
All in favor? There you go.
Thanks, Joey.
Okay, thank you all. It was a pleasure meeting you.
See you later. All right, so I don't necessarily have someone lined up from Vestal on this, so hopefully you won't need questions from them. Vestal Hills, they have some mausoleum. This is another cemetery where out-of-state certificate holders control the place. In this particular case, they have a mausoleum that they inherited from before they ran the cemetery. That is in poor condition. You get a bunch of complaints about it. They have work they need to do to renovate it. And Andrew Hickey, our accountant in Binghamton, did a bang-up job on his audit of them and discovered, among other things, that they had a several $100,000 surplus in their permanent maintenance fund. That they had, in fact, more money in there than their actual statutory liability. That money is available to be used to do their work. It's really so they, even though the papers contain a petition for court approval of PM loan, there is no PM loan approval needed. We left those in there because a lot of the numbers and calculations are laid out in there. They kind of do it all together. But they really need to get this done. They get complaints about this mausoleum. We get complaints about this mausoleum. I visited there in April. There were places where I was at. There were places where I was scared to walk, and there were places where I was told not to walk. So this really needs to get done as soon as possible. The cemetery has struggled over time. They are now profitable, and they really need to get this done. The one thing I'll add is that because of the out-of-state nature of this, I wasn't able to do an income comparison showing what the people at the insiders make at the cemetery, because mostly what they make comes from related entities, the out-of-state parent corporation, not from Vestal Hills itself. So instead of doing a chart, I simply attached the relevant pages from the 990s so you can see what the executives are making. But bear in mind, some of these rather large-looking sums that they're making are not mostly for their work at Vestal. Obviously, when it says zero for Vestal and like $1 bazillion from somewhere else, presumably some portion of that is attributable to the work they're doing at Vestal, even though they're not paying themselves from Vestal Hills.
Can you describe the structure just so we understand it?
I'll try. The certificate holder is an entity called.
That's structure, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah. There are several different related entities involved here, and I'm afraid I'm going to misspeak as to which one is which, but it doesn't really matter. There's an entity, CMS Mid-Atlantic. I believe that is the cemetery parent, because there's also a financing entity that does the back office work for the cemetery. That entity, CMS entity, is the one that holds the certificates. That's the one that all these other guys have been paid out of, and there are some folks who work for Vestal Hills. There are other folks who work for CMS. There is an arrangement in place that was approved by the board years ago on functioning, on how this all functions. And I'm not sure I can describe it better than that.
What's their, for lack of a better term, what's their CMS's portfolio of cemeteries?
They have cemeteries in, at least in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and I can't remember where else. There are a bunch of other places. They are now, CMS now, to complicate matters further, CMS is still the certificate holder. The certificate holding structure has not changed, but CMS's shares are now owned by somebody else. They were owned by an individual, they're now owned by another corporation. It's like 3 levels removed from
So
ownership.
doesn't the cemetery file annual reports?
They do.
And may that reflect how individuals are paid through the cemetery? You know, they don't combine their annual report.
Oh,
Other
what
cemeteries-
the individuals are actually paid from the cemetery? Yeah, that's all reported.
Is that in here?
I thought we included that in the most recent annual.
The 990.
The 990 shows
overall.
No, it's both. They only have one executive, they only have one officer or trustee who's actually paid from the cemetery, formally speaking.
Who's that?
That is Roberta Gertis. She is the person who's actually on site for them all the time, and she is paid from the cemetery. The other board members, the main person involved here is Bill Pasadelis. Does not actually draw anything from the cemetery. He's paid by whichever of the CMS entities.
So that then is reflected in the 990. Column D
Yes.
would be payments from the cemetery, and only Roberta shows a payment.
The reason I couldn't break it out further is if you look at column F, other compensation from the entity and related entities, the non-salary piece of the compensation, the IRS doesn't require you to distinguish that between the entity and its relatives. So I couldn't do an allocation of that for anybody to say, well, a certain portion of that came from the cemetery or not. My guess is, for Roberta, that is 100% from the cemetery, and from the other guys, it's 0% from the cemetery, because none of them actually draw any money from this entity.
Can you help me understand why there's 2 numbers on column D for each person?
Yeah, that is, yes. That gives the hours per week on this particular one, and the hours per week for related entities. That gives the hours per week for the top line for the hours are for this entity, and the bottom line is for its corporate relatives. And I'm using that term broadly because New York cemeteries do not have corporate relatives.
Thank you for saying that. I was going to correct you, because you call the CMS the parent of the cemetery's parent. There is no such thing.
There's absolutely never any such thing. Yeah, I'm speaking that way just because it's
The way
in
you describe it.
some ways looks like that, although they do follow, these guys do follow all corporate formalities in terms of preserving the not-for-profit status of the New York entity. We have a long history making sure that they do that.
So, current management, were they also management when this building was about to deteriorate?
It mostly deteriorated before they came in. They didn't have money until recently to fix it.
So what's the history? How did they get allowed to get to this point?
How old are these buildings? The
When
60s?
was it built?
I want to say they date from the 60s. Wait, Brendan sent it back. I want to say they date from the 60s, or their 70s. They're old. Let me see if I can find Brendan's email. But again, speaking broadly, most of the bad stuff that has happened had already happened before they came in. When they first took over the cemetery, there really wasn't much in the way of additional money. They didn't have the resources to fix these up. They've continued to deteriorate, and at this point, they're just getting a lot of complaints about this. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, here we go. Mid-1960s. The original one, the Court of Faith, the one that's in worse shape, is the mid-1960s. The other is mid-1980s. Buzzy and CMS came in, I want to say, early 2000s. So there was 20 to 40 years of wear and tear before they got involved.
And the total project cost is $256,000.
Yeah.
So it's really not.
Not amazing. Not a huge deal, but.
Did they do anything with their certificates?
They are. They actually have made an effort to pay down the certificates. I think I have to look. I met with them on this together with Andrew and Brendan, our accountant and investigator for the area, and I believe they have. I wish I should have included this. I'm sorry I didn't. But I believe they paid both interest and principal.
And so because
They're not accruing interest for sure.
And so because they uncovered this surplus in the
We found the surplus.
The loan that they were planning to get approved, that they're not, that's not.
No, there's no.
Because
they're not recommending approval. They're not asking for a loan. That's off the table.
Okay, they could have.
I would have recommended against it because they don't need them. They don't need the
Well,
loan. If the only way to finance this was by a PM loan, we'd probably give them an even more rigorous financial analysis, but the bottom line is this work has to get done. This is an actual safety hazard.
And they can fund it.
But if they needed a loan, I'd probably be here recommending approving the loan.
I think part of what Tony's going to do is just the general fund is sufficient condition that they will be able to maintain the properties.
So on Exhibit A, you have data from 2013 to 2016. Why don't we have anything for 2017?
Probably because they had an extension on filing their 27 financials. Or I don't recall, again, if Andrew could have been here, he'd answer this off the top of his head, but there are cemeteries that are on, especially some of these oddball ones can be on, where there's an out-of-stater involved, can be on a fiscal year, not a calendar year, in which case it might not even be due yet. They're not non-compliant. That's not the reason we don't have 2017. If we don't have 2017, it's either because we gave them an extension or it wasn't ready back when Andrew did the financial write-up, which shouldn't be the case because he just did this, or that it's not due.
Are they required to be in compliance?
Generally speaking, we're not going to recommend board approval unless they're either A, in compliance, or B, if they're out of compliance and come up with a plan to get in compliance to whatever they're out of compliance with. That's sort of a broad statement here.
I can answer the question about the connection to the general fund in terms of ongoing maintenance.
I mean, they're not. They don't really have.
It looks like they have a decent general fund. Looks like 1.1 million.
Right. I mean, maintaining these once they're fixed is going to cost a heck of a lot less now that they're solvent than trying to get them up to speed.
But Tony's making a point that they were unable to maintain them, and so. And I agree. Once you've got something that's repaired and new, the instance of repairs goes down. Buy a new car. I get that, but you also do it. There's some ongoing.
I have no problem with raising with them the possibility of designating a certain portion of sales revenue for mausoleum maintenance. Having said that, they're not. These are old mausoleums. They're not really actively selling here. They may have a spot here or there, but it's not like these are major places where these ones are. The right way to do this is when you make sales in that mausoleum, you put aside a certain percentage of money to maintain it.
But not having done that, they could correct that by using other income to settle.
Right. I mean, I have no problem raising it with them. I'd be a little reluctant not having them here to commit to a specific percentage.
I'm not sure I'm even a fan of it because, money's green and they've got to make, you can set up a maintenance fund, then you shorten something else.
Well, it's good for budgeting purposes.
They're on the ground. Yeah.
If the money's not really restricted, it's not a bad thing for budgeting purposes.
Yeah.
For the cemetery to see it as such.
Well, and the idea that when they took over, I'm making assumptions, but the idea that when they took over, these things were in such poor shape that the idea of maintenance was not on the table. It was that they were going to need some replacement. Or not replacement, but do this major restoration.
The only wrinkle I'll add to that is that, as we discovered, much to everyone's chagrin at Whispering Maples, some of those defects were patent, others of them were latent. And until you start poking around, you don't really, until you start poking around and examining what's wrong, you don't really, and also, at some point, deterioration begins to build on itself. So it may be that some of the stuff just wasn't apparent because I don't think their due diligence consists of drilling into walls. And at some point, you really are only going to notice this when people start complaining, or the maintenance guys go in there and see something significant, and that takes a while until that happens.
Right, I was just.
Not having been there in 2003.
Thinking more about the idea of now, putting aside or, considering some portion for maintenance, the fact that it hadn't been done before, we're really starting with a different situation now, different considerations.
Sure, they've been totally willing to work with us on things like that, so I have no problem at least discussing it with them.
Any other questions or comments, concerns? I'll make a motion, that'll be Tony, that we approve the application of Vestal Plumes for a major renovation of $256,000 and whatever cents is the right number.
Subject to local permits.
Subject to local permits.
And our review of those full stamp set of plans.
Okay. Since you will be writing down the minutes.
I'll be putting that in
Is
the letter
that
too.
all we need?
Yeah.
Right? Is that all we need? I have a motion, make a motion.
Second.
Okay. All in favor? Aye. Motion is approved. I think that is.
Do we have somebody who would like to address
Yes,
this?
no, I think that's the end of our general business. We're, public comment,
Matt, there's a gentleman outside waiting for us. May I make a recommendation that we take a 2-minute break before we do the public comment?
sure. You okay there,
Do
Rich?
you know how to pause this thing? Just
No.
Here, hang on.
All you can do is mute it.
Oh, you're right. That's fine.
Turn the camera.
Josh went to get Tom.
Okay. All right. Well.
This is known as a breath break.
All right. We're off.
You all right?
Come on in.
All right,
Yes, now we're good.
back on the record, we're here for public comment. Sir,
Hi,
introduce yourself.
how are you? David Goldstein, representing, I'm at the law firm of Sir Tillman Ballin, Adler and Hyman on Long Island, and my client is Mount Pleasant Cemetery Association in Santa Mauritius. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to come in and speak to you all. What Mount Pleasant is proposing to do, and I've been talking and communicating with Louis and Tony Willow for a while about this, is to have a separately organized for-profit subsidiary that would operate a pet crematory. And the separateness is, I think, the fundamental aspect of how the cemetery will approach this. The operations of the pet crematory, the separate for-profit subsidiary, would be the daily operations. The cemetery would have no involvement whatsoever. There'd be a separate entity, separate employees, separate accounting, separate books, separate records, separate management, separate board, on a separate parcel of land with a separate entrance. And the name there'd be separation in the name as well. Mount Pleasant wouldn't be anywhere in the name of the entity or the crematory. They're completely fine with having the operation of the crematory be contingent on the cemetery division's ongoing review and inspection of the separateness. So, this isn't just, this is how we're going to set it up. This is how it will be operated going forward. We, our back and forth, we were informed of 3 potential impediments that were a source of concern. One was whether a nonprofit exempt under the Internal Revenue Code would be able to have a for-profit subsidiary. And we've submitted, and I'm happy to leave copies or send you copies, but we've submitted detailed information and IRS guidance that should provide comfort there. And if any of you have heard of unrelated business income tax, in fact, that came from a fact pattern where a New York nonprofit owned a for-profit subsidiary. NYU Law School owned the Mullen Noodle Company. And out of that fact pattern, you get...
Somebody left them the shares, right?
Yes, yep. Yes. And what was happening was that because the Noodle Company was owned by a nonprofit, the university, the profits were initially exempt from income tax, and that was really unfair for the other Noodle companies. So that's how we got UBIC. And another concern was whether under the not-for-profit corporation law, a New York nonprofit can have a for-profit subsidiary, and that's an incredibly widespread practice. And again, there's lots of documentation on that. That's something you all, if you want to get some comfort, other than me and the documentation I provided, you can certainly check with the Charities Bureau. I was not too long ago at a symposium where the deputy chief of the Charities Bureau, Karen Kutzler-Goldman, stated from the podium with Jim Sheehan, the Charities Bureau head, and Alvin Bragg, who's the deputy AG for social justice, within 10 feet of her, that the use of LLCs by New York nonprofits is a widespread practice, and in fact it is. There are many examples, including Lincoln Center. In the materials I sent in, there's a law review article that talks about the YWCA, which happens to be a New York nonprofit, the National YWCA. And it says that over a 15-year period, the YWCA developed a computer software company, purchased a plastics company, started a clothing design line, opened a charter school, operated a ceiling tile business, and invested in real estate in partnership with other investors. And fairly recently, the Court of Appeals... Yeah, right.
I'm glad we don't regulate them.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to do that audit.
Yeah, well, so the Court of Appeals decided a case, the Greater Jamaica Development Corporation, not too long ago, and the fact pattern in that case involved a nonprofit in Queens, the Greater Jamaica Development Corporation, which owned an LLC that was for-profit and operated parking garages in Jamaica. And the Court of Appeals found absolutely no issue with the fact that the for-profit was owned by the nonprofit. The only issue was whether the for-profit would be exempt from New York City real estate taxes, which it wasn't. And then I think the third impediment that was a concern was the anti-combination statute in Article 15 of the not-for-profit corporation law. And there, we looked at that, and I looked at the legislative findings and declarations in Section 1 of Chapter 560 when the law was passed, and the focus, not only is the focus in the section itself, the combination between cemeteries and funeral homes, but in legislative findings and declarations, the legislature said that its concern was protection of its citizens, the state citizens, when making important and difficult decisions regarding the burial of loved ones. So that, and clearly a combination between funeral home and a cemetery is relevant to decision making when we're having to deal with the burial of a loved one, not the combination between a pet crematory and a cemetery. And again, combination, honestly, I think, given the fact that the cemetery is so determined to address your concern by enshrining this separateness, combination is almost the wrong word, because it really isn't a combination. The proposal here is separateness from beginning to end. And I'll be quiet.
Let me give you just a little bit of background.
Well, let me just make some comments. I appreciate this. This is in public comment, right? So we appreciate that. Board members are free to ask questions, but it's not under consideration. Mm-hmm. We only consider as an entity, and there's no application. So again, any comments, information is informal and not binding.
That's part of what I was going to say is that we have actually asked the cemetery, the cemetery asked, should we just put it in an application? I'm concerned about the cemetery spending resources, they're going out and hiring a broker, hiring an engineer, doing all the design work involved, doing all the stuffs, setting up entities for a transaction that the board would think is somehow essentially a non-starter. I don't want them using their resources for that, which is why I've kind of pushed them away from just putting in an application to do this. There's one fact that's been represented to us that I think is kind of important for you guys to know, which is that the parcel in question that they're talking about putting the crematory on is not, in fact, part of the cemetery's land. It's a separate parcel of land.
Right.
So they wouldn't be taking cemetery land and transforming it for non-cemetery use.
Who owns the parcel?
They own it.
The cemetery.
Not for profit.
The not-for-profit owns it, but it says a separate parcel.
Right.
Do they pay taxes on it?
I'm not sure off the top of my head. I'm not sure.
But it's been represented to me, I haven't checked the property records, that piece has never been designated for cemetery use by the local authorities. That was something I was concerned about, because if they're taking cemetery land and essentially encumbering it with non-cemetery use, that's a different transaction if it's non-cemetery land. Also, there's sort of I actually had a question, which is, as we learned, as Tony and Jill and I learned over the course of the Abingdon Hill pet crematory, a pet cemetery or crematory, unlike New York cemeteries, have to be not-for-profit, period, full stop. Well, they can be religious corporations, they can be municipal. The one thing they can never, ever, ever, ever be is for-profit. Pet crematories can be not-for-profit or for-profit. I know council has advice he would like to give the board, which is obviously privileged, and we're not going to do that in public session unless the board so says. But I wonder whether this might look a little different, and has your board considered the pet crematory in fact being a not-for-profit? Or would that defeat the purpose, because then the money from it wouldn't be flowing back to the cemetery? Is there a way to structure it? See, the logic, we have plenty of cemeteries, we have some cemeteries where a piece of cemetery land is leased to a for-profit business. In fact, not too far from them, there's a cemetery that owns a golf course. It does not operate that golf course as a subsidiary. It leases that golf course to another entity that runs it. It draws rent. I had asked, how about structuring it that way? The response from the cemetery is, no, we want to control the subsidiary. So is that, I don't know, just throwing out there, is that something to think about?
Okay. But,
Just
again, this public comment, I appreciate the issue of getting some sense of the board before you engage in expensive activity. The best I can offer on that is, you certainly can talk to our council and the division, and then at some point you have to make your own determination as to whether that case can be made, because we can't respond to that. I mean, I don't have any particular objections, but I don't have enough information to make an informed choice, and it wouldn't matter anyway because it's not before us, right? So.
Can I just ask one question? It's
Sure.
pretty fundamental. With regard to that land that's now owned by the not-for-profit that would be used by the for-profit LLC, whatever the structure is, are they going to be purchasing that land? I mean, I guess my question, the big question is a consideration of assets of the not-for-profit being transferred to the for-profit and how that would be handled. We don't need to consider it now. That's just something that I think we would.
And I think I can give you a sense of that, because that's something that they thought about in thinking about how to structure this. And I think the plan is to lease that land. So.
Okay. I'm a little cognizant of some time issues.
Okay.
So.
Sorry to confuse.
No.
Thank you for.
Listen, I really appreciate you.
Thank you for waiting for us patiently, and thank you for providing us with your comments. For our, any other members of the public wishing to speak? Today, really, that would be a first time.
Maybe second. That time you weren't here.
But then he called in.
Can we try very quickly to schedule the next meeting?
Sure, didn't we already do it?
No, we didn't, because Jill had a conflict with our default date for the meeting. I have a feeling the scheduling thing. You can get out of here now.
Okay.
I have a feeling this. I have a feeling the scheduling thing is going to be a nightmare.
I think it was this month we had to change.
Yeah.
The 8th
No,
is-
the 8th comes up pretty quick.
The 8th, well, I don't know what we can get on for the 8th, but look, why don't we schedule, if that's what we're talking, if everyone is free on the 8th, why don't we schedule it for then? And if it doesn't look like we can actually get anything ready for you in time, bear in mind that our whole calendar of when we're supposed to get things to you is going to have to be in advance for a meeting that's soon after this one. We'll have to come up
I have it on my calendar, so I don't have any.
Okay, so fine.
Right,
So we'll do
go
that.
quick, and again,
And
the
it
only
will probably be a very short agenda to make up for
The
the
only
very long
downside of
agenda.
that is, and I'm pushing folks to get stuff in earlier than they have, so that we can get through our processes, get out.
There are two things.
In a week.
There are two things that are close to ready that I think we can get on. It may just be that.
So we will.
Okay.
Well, do you think?
Next meeting will be August 8th at 10:30.
Okay.
On live.
Deal.
No, I was going to say, and then maybe, I don't know where that falls within the 15 days that council for where he says.
Cutting it close.
I know.
Let's see. Well, let's see.
I mean, it can be considered another month, but.
Right. Can I make a motion? We adjourn to executive session? Do we need a motion? Is that?
Yes, go ahead.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Close executive session.
Get out of here.
It's a big button, 2/3 up.
Tom's right behind. Right behind.
I'm trying to figure
Those
this out.
cemeteries have become my most exciting part of my portfolio.
Thank you. based on me.
That's right, it's up there on top.
Oh, this one. We're, by the way, we're off muting. There we go.
All right, well, if we took the vote to come out of executive session, then we'll come out of executive session. We're back in public session. We have made one decision based on earlier conversations, which is to table the application of Beverly Hills and Rose Hills. That's right.
Same thing.
Same thing. Table it and to allow the cemetery to submit the additional information that they discussed to us for additional consideration. And that's the motion that I'm making. Sufficient, Tony?
Yeah.
Okay, I second that motion.
Well, okay.
And a motion to
All in
adjourn.
favor? Motion to adjourn. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Have a great summer.